Hello viewers, this is a review of the Sony RX1R Mark II, and I'm also going to compare it versus the RX1R Mark I. So I'm going to talk about a few things, including the handling and the features, and at the end go pretty detailed analysis of what's different between the two and whether you should get one or the other, considering the price difference. Okay, so let's move on to talking about the Rx1R Mark II first. So this is the camera. It's released near the end of 2015, and it's definitely a halo product for Sony because it's so expensive. So I think the MSRP is around $3,300 US. It's a fixed lens, 35mm f2.0, and this is the body, and it looks almost the same as Mark I, but I'd like to go over a few elements of it. The biggest difference in my mind, well, are the differences really are the sensor and the EVF. So it might not look like there's an EVF, but if you press this latch downward, a finder comes up, and it's a really neat mechanism. It pops up, and then this thing extends so that you can have the proper focus into the EVF so that it's not looking like it's out of focus. So that's one big difference, and the other one is the tilt screen. I'll talk about the sensor in a second. So here's the tilt screen, and it pops out, and it can go as high as this angle and as low as this angle. So it's not enough for selfies, but I don't think you can, or you're planning to buy this for taking selfies anyway. So this is actually very useful for waist level shooting, and that's one thing the old RX1R or RX1 lacked. So this is a really nice feature. And by the way, this thing goes in just like that. You don't have to do anything else besides press it in, not like the RX100 series. So the lens actually is identical. So as some readers have pointed out, one reason that you know it's identical is because it says Carl Zeiss on it instead of just Zeiss. And as some people know, all Zeiss lenses have gone to just Zeiss branding instead of Carl Zeiss. So this is probably from an old batch of leftover Carl Zeiss 35 f2 lenses that Sony has, and it's put onto this new body verbatim. So, and let's see, going around the body, here is the hot shoe with the smart connectors. So you can see some metal contacts in here. Let me just take this off. So there's some contacts in here. I've never used this one because obviously you don't need to attach the EVF on it anymore, so there's really not too much use to it. So the mode dial and the switch and the exposure compensation, they're all identical to before, and this is C1 instead of C. So anything else? So here's a little bit of branding here. And here is this detector to sense if your eye is close to the EVF or not. There's a little bit more of a ledge around the playback button. Same with this wheel. It's pushed out further because this part is now thicker than before because of the tilt screen. And other than that, these are basically the same. And over here, there's a symbol for NFC. Let me just focus this a bit. So this is this camera is Wi-Fi enabled, also NFC enabled, and on the bottom you have the battery latch just like before. You have the battery and the memory card in there. And let me just show you how does this compare versus the Mark I. So once again, the lens is identical, virtually identical. And on the left side is the same. So you have the ports So you have, let me see, HDMI, a microphone port, and a multi-port for charging and data communication. So let's see, here it's actually, the order is a little different. On the Mark 1 on the left, you have the charging, HDMI or micro HDMI, and the microphone, and on the right it's shifted around a bit. And I believe this one's USB is multi-USB, meaning you can plug in the remote control cable into it, and this one, the old one, cannot do that. It's only for charging. So that's one subtle difference that you may not have noticed. So on the front, one thing is, and this is one way to distinguish the two, is notice there's a C mode here for autofocus. So that's for continuous autofocusing. For the old one, the Mark 1, there is no C. And actually they had C on the image in the early days when they were when they announced this, but then they took it off, probably because they realized it would not perform very well for continuous autofocus. But this one, the new one, does have that. So let's see, onto the top. So virtually identical, except this one has the flash pop-up, which is through a latch here. And this one has the EVF. So depending on your shooting style, this might be the deal maker for you. Or if you like fill flash, you know, at 1/2000 in the daylight, then this is a more compact package, because this one you have to carry a portable flash with you. So that's kind of up to personal preference. I have a feeling most people would prefer the EVF, given that you don't really use flash too often with such a low light capable camera. Alright, so continuing at the top. So again, this is C1, this is C, and the reason why this is C1 is because now the delete button is C2, whereas previously the delete button could not do anything else than delete image. And there's a bit of a logo refinement on the magnifying glass, otherwise it's the same. And on the right, it's basically the same, except there's no NFC logo. So how do the two feel in the hand? Well, really almost identical, because this one is about, let me see, 2 millimeters thicker. So can you feel that? Actually, you can. So you can feel a 2 millimeter difference in thickness when you hold the new one. And you do feel it's a little heavier, because it's 25 grams out of 507 grams. So it's very slightly heavier and thicker, and you can feel that, but it's really very, very minor. And you might actually prefer it, because this one actually feels a little more solid in the hand because it's thicker than the old version, the Rx1r Mark 1. So the big thing here, the biggest difference I would say, is probably the image sensor. So on the old Rx1R and Rx1, it's a 24 megapixel sensor. The 1R doesn't have the anti-aliasing filter. On the new one, it's a 42, so you went from 2.4 to 4.2, and it's also the same sensor as on the A7R Mark II, which means it's a backside illuminated sensor, meaning that you basically get better low light performance. There's less of a gap between the different photocells. So you get an incredible 42 megapixels in this almost pocketable camera, and you get better high ISO performance. And also I think the sensor readout is much faster because of newer technology and the newer processor in here, so that the autofocus is sped up. But there is actually a bit of a sluggishness to this too, and I'll mention that a bit later in the video. Let's do a quick autofocus test. This is by no means a real-world autofocus test, but I'll also talk about my experience a bit before I do this little test. And that is the new one, the Mark II, feels a lot faster than this 30% improvement that Sony claims. So the old one, I tend to miss focus quite frequently, and it can be frustrating at times. It's really the one downside of the original RX1R, but the new one is pretty snappy. It's not the fastest. I think the new A7R Mark II, when I used it, was faster, but this is definitely usable, and it's a lot snappier, as you'll see in this quick little test. So let's do that. First, I'm gonna use the old RX1R. So this is the Mark I, and I'm just going to focus between a close object and a far object. And you can see that it's failing to lock focus. So there you go. Okay, so you got a feel for that. And now the Mark II. You can see that in even the case where it failed to lock focus before with the old one, it's working fine for the Mark II. I don't have to go for the edge. So a lot faster, and I think you would agree this is better than just 30%. I'll say it's almost twice as fast. So it's great in that respect for autofocusing for the new version. In low light, it still has a bit of trouble sometimes. So I don't think it can focus down to as low light as the A7R Mark II, but it's definitely very usable, as you can see. So it's definitely not an issue anymore, I would say. Alright, so another thing to talk about is the lens, which is really the main reason you would want to buy this camera over, say, an A7 series plus a 35mm f2.8. So this lens really has some very nice characters to it, and you'll see what I'm talking about if you compare pictures taken with this versus just the normal f2.8 35mm or other 35mm, because it really is sharp, edge to edge, and has this color and bokeh rendition that is just outstanding, and that applies to both the original series and the new one. And one thing that is worth mentioning is these are marked as 35mm, but they're actually a little wider than that. And I did a test on my own to find out what exactly focal length these are at, and it happens to be 33mm. So you're not buying 35 f2, you're buying actually 33 f2. So that means you get a little more in the picture, and in a way I actually prefer it to the normal 35mm. I think the Sony 35mm f2.8 lens for the A7 series is actually a little narrower than 35. So if I were to choose between the two, I would choose a little wider version. And it's kind of rare to have an available 33mm lens in the market. So in a way, that's what makes this unique. The 33mm focal length, which gives you a little bit wider field, but not too wide. And also the nature of the image itself through this lens, which is very colorful. The out of focus areas look very creamy, and it's very good, and the sharpness from edge to edge. So these are things that are really good about this lens. It has a bit of distortion to it, but that's all fixed internally, and when that happens it crops down to a little narrower view, but that's okay. Alright, so right now is probably a good time to really go into detail comparing the two, because there is quite a bit of price difference. For the new one, the Mark II, you can probably get it for $3,300 list price right now because it just came out. But the old one has been around for a while, and you can get a used copy for around 1,300 or so US dollars as of the time of this recording. So that's almost $2,000 difference between the two. So it makes a really valid point about, is this enough to upgrade? So first, before I talk about what's different, let me talk about what's identical. So the lens. So the lenses are identical. So there's nothing different even in one bit between the two lenses. So that you're getting the same thing. And the other thing is the rendering of the lens. So that's preserved. So whatever you liked about the previous version in terms of the lens quality, it's the same with the new version. And the LCD, they're identical, except this one tilts, but in terms of resolution and the quality of it, they're identical. I think they're both 1.2 million dots. The handling, they're also the same. This one is 2 millimeters thicker. It's 25 grams heavier, I believe. And that doesn't really matter because it's not noticeable. And the batteries are identical. The ports are almost identical, except I think the new one, USB port, you can attach the smart USB remote control to it, whereas the previous one, the USB is only for charging. So those are all the identical aspects. Now what's different? I'll say the biggest is probably the sensor. So you have 42 megapixels and you have 24 in the old one. The new one, just from my experience, it's about 2 stops better in terms of low light performance. So the old one, I usually limit the auto ISO to 6400. The new one, I have it set at 25,600. So that's 2 stops different. And that might make a difference if you always shoot in low light or indoor situations. Now, the good thing about the 42 megapixels is you can crop really aggressively. So even if you crop half the image, that's still 21 megapixels. So that's great if you don't frame very carefully, or if you want the whole 42 megapixels, is perfect for landscape pictures. But for some reason, I doubt that landscape shooters would go for the RX1R because this is really a pocket shooter for carrying with you everywhere. Now, one disadvantage of the 42 megapixels that's often overlooked is the amount of, I guess, stability you need to take a sharp picture. So this one does not have in-body stabilization like the A7R Mark II, so you have to be really careful. And Sony designed that into the auto setting. So when you are in aperture priority, in the default setting, the minimum shutter speed is 1/100. In the old one is 1/80, but in actual use, in the old one I could get away with 1/40, and the new one in actual use probably 1/60, 1/80. So you do lose a stop almost there. So you gain 2 stops from the sensor, but you lose a stop because it's hard to keep a stable image when it's 42 megapixels. So keep that in mind. And let's see, another difference is the tilt screen. This, I think, depending on your shooting style, could be a very important factor for you. You can shoot down at your waist level, you can shoot above crowds, and when you're shooting from ground level, it's a lot easier with this one than the previous version. EVF is another major difference. You have basically the previous EVF, I think the quality is a little better than the previous module EVF, basically integrated into the camera. So you have it everywhere you go. And you can, if you have to shoot via an optical or EVF finder, then it's almost a deal breaker for you for the old one, whereas you have to shoot it like a point and shoot, like a normal RX1R series kind of camera, even though those new ones have EVF in them too. So now in terms of the speed of the two, this one has a newer processor, so the autofocus is faster, but actually the operation it feels slower because it's dealing with a larger file, and I'll show you what I mean. So if I take a picture and then I press this, it takes a long time to show up. So I definitely noticed this, and the annoying thing is if you press it too soon, it'll show you it's still writing to a card, and I have a fast card in here, and it just doesn't, it freezes up until it finishes writing. It takes a while, so that's kind of annoying. It's definitely not a speedy camera like the Olympus series. It feels sluggish in use, and this one is not a speed demon either, but because the files are smaller, the write time is and the read time is faster. So let me just try it here. So I magnify, you can see it's a little faster than before. Than the new one. So keep that in mind too. I mean, you gain some, you lose some. 42 megapixels has its disadvantages as well. Let's see. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention that's identical between the two is once the camera goes to sleep, the focusing resets to infinity. It's a super annoying feature if you like to zone focus or do manual focusing, but they have not changed that. The noise the lens makes when focusing, also identical because it's the same lens assembly. One difference, again, Wi-Fi, NFC, whereas this one has no wireless connectivity whatsoever. So if you're the person who likes to take a picture and then share with your friends right away, you can only do it with this. Although you could do the wireless SD card in this one and then have that as a workaround. Movie-wise, I'm not a movie shooter, so from my limited knowledge of the two, this one has the XAVCS codec, whereas this one doesn't. And I think this one's the old one. So the quality is a little better on this, but again, I don't think anyone's buying this for filmmaking. Let's see, battery life. This one the new one actually has 70 shots less of a battery life than the old one. So the old one is quoted at 270 shots per battery, and this one is at 200. And that through real life use, I've actually noticed. So this one eats through the battery a lot faster. So 200 shots on a good day. And if you leave the camera on for a little longer, you can go through 2-3 batteries easily in one day of use. Non-aggressive use of this camera. So in that respect, again, the new bigger megapixel count and the faster processor have its disadvantage as well, so it's more power hungry. One other thing, this one has lossless raw, I believe, and let me just check that. So this is really it doesn't matter for what I use in my normal shooting, but here you go. So you can see raw file type, you can choose compressed or uncompressed. The previous RX1R is only compressed raw, but really in 1% of situation does that really matter. So that's about the differences I can think of. But finally, really the question is around, should you pay almost $2,000 more for the Mark II? And my answer is, depends on what kind of shooter you are. If you buy this camera for shooting at parties or friends gatherings, and you tend to keep the setting at f2.0, which is really one of the main reasons you buy this camera, then I don't think you really need the 42 megapixels, because a small part of your image will be in focus and everything else will be in the background as a blur. And it doesn't matter if the blur is 42 megapixels or 24 megapixels because there's no detail in it. So for that reason, if you're shooting just like 35mm f2, keeping it always there, or even 2.8, and shooting at someone close and trying to blur out the background, which is really a good aspect of this camera, then I don't think you need the 42 megapixels. If you're someone who cannot shoot without an EVF or optical viewfinder, then it comes down to no choice because you have to get the Mark II. Although there is a separate EVF module on this one, it's a little finicky. You have to attach onto it, but it can work. So that is one possibility. But if you want a compact solution with EVF, then you have to go with this one. If you're someone who crops a lot or shoots landscape, then the new one is definitely the better camera. However, again, I doubt landscape shooters are really the main target for the RX1 series. This is really the pocketable camera, full frame camera for you to carry everywhere and shoot and almost journal your daily life. So that's for that reason, you know, for $2,000 of difference, I think it's probably not worth the upgrade. However, as time goes on and as this video gets older and older, the difference in price will become smaller. At that point, this may become a no-brainer. So that's my analysis. And please leave your comments below and subscribe if you like this video. And again, thanks very much for going through this very lengthy comparison and wordy comparison of the two. And hopefully it's been helpful. Thanks, and hope to see you again.